it hurts me deeply that I, like you, will go through this lifetime never knowing the pleasure of my foreskin. And the reality of that hits home hard, deep to the core. And I think the way that I've found a way past that is to not only undertake a restoration personally for my own good, but to find a cause that was bigger than me and to put my heart and soul into it. And that's what I do on a daily basis.
The Intact Again podcast is an oral history project where we share stories from those who have been circumcised and are working to restore what was taken from us. Our hope is to inspire each other with our collective stories of loss and recovery.
Hello and welcome back to the Intact Again podcast. In this episode, we talk with Tim, an Australian lawyer and advocate for human rights, especially in matters of circumcision. He recounts his country's transformation from one where nearly every male child was circumcised to one where almost every male child is now left intact. He gives us a hopeful view of how other countries may make this same transformation. He also talks about his own personal story of how circumcision prevented him from fully experiencing intimacy with his late wife and the effects that this has had on him all these years later. His wife was the one that discovered restoration and was the one that started him on his restoring journey. This one is quite emotional, but it is an important story to tell. Without further ado, here is Tim's story, or as we like to call it, his restory. Would you mind if we talked a little bit about your lived experience? Because I know you've gone to a pretty impressive CI level, considering where you started from.
Yeah, I think back now instinctively when I was a young adolescent and, progressed from baths to showers, I can recall standing in the shower at times, pulling my skin forward on my penis and thinking, gee, that feels good, but not really understanding why. And it wasn't until I was nearly 19, I'm in a gym and it had communal showers. So, we'd done a gym session, I'm in the communal shower. There's a fellow in there that I knew and I still know, and he was intact. And until then, the very few males that I'd seen a penis on, they were all cut. My cousins were cut. Most of the kids in school, that if you ever saw one in the odd change room or whatever, they're all cut. So you don't realise that anything's wrong until you go, oh, that looks different to mine. And remember thinking, are there two types of penis? Now, I'm 60. So this is 1982? Something like that. There's no internet, no Google, nothing. So I had to go to a library and I had to find an anatomy text. And I pulled out the anatomy text and I worked out what had been done. And to say I was gobsmacked would be, it's not even the right word. I was absolutely just floored that somebody would do that to someone else. And I remember asking my parents about it at the time, and the answer I got back was to look like your father. I call that the curse of the family penis. I got the family penis. My brother got it too. And I have hated what was done to me since then, but didn't realise I could do anything about it. And then I met my now late wife was a 23-year-old, and she knew exactly how I hated what was done. We were researching my loss of sensation and sensitivity and really my total lack of interest in any form of intimacy whatsoever. 8 years ago, thereabouts, in mid-2016, she was the one that discovered foreskin restoration was a thing and was possible and encouraged me to begin. And this gets quite emotional, and I know I'll get emotional here because here's the impact. I'm an MGM survivor. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. And I'll spend the rest of my life while my arse is pointing to God's green earth and I'm upright, defending children from this practice because I know the psychological damage that it did. There's a number of aspects of this, and I was talking to Dan Bollinger one day from Intact America, and we were just talking stuff through, and I was telling him about this recurring nightmare that I used to get. It would be that I'd be lured into, and it would become a dark, confined space from which there was no escape. And I would wake up in fear and terror. And many times I'd be screaming. We didn't know what it was, and she passed away before I discovered what that probably was. And I got some help to overcome that, and it was fairly intense. From that day on, I've not had that nightmare ever again. And that was something that occurred to me maybe once, maybe more frequent, but at least once every 3 weeks, and had done so my whole life. And it was Dan that explained to me that that's the circumcision trauma. And the dark from which you couldn't escape will be being strapped down as a neonate and having your glands ripped away and cut and the pain. And so that's just one part. And then I didn't understand why I would recoil from my late wife's touch when we were intimate and stuff. And she didn't understand why either. And, you know, she thought it was because she repulsed me. And I now realise that it was me withdrawing from her because she wanted to touch a very part of me that had been damaged and hurt. And she's passed away, and I can't fix that. I can't go back and fix that. And that hurts deep to the core. But I know that if she was still alive today, and she would understand the difference that it's now made, and she'd be my greatest cheerleader. She still is my greatest cheerleader, but it hurts, you know. My circumcision as a neonate impacted not only me, but impacted the very most intimate way two human beings can communicate. She went to a grave never knowing what the answer to that might have been. Now, that hurts. I remember I went back to Germany the year after she'd passed and spent some time back in Dürrestadt. I think I was looking for the answers as to why. And I came away from that and I went, you know what? Sometimes there is no answer to the why. Sometimes it just is. And that's just life. Life isn't always easy. It does gives us, pardon the French here, gives us shit sometimes. And some people seem to get more of it than others. But I can truly say that when I went back there this time for the short couple of days before I went to Cologne, I found joy in the life we shared, and I found joy in the times that we had together. And I even found joy in the time that we had together there before she passed away, where there was just the three of us there again, daughter and myself and my wife, where we were able to just share some time together, and that was important. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? I talked about those stages of grief. You go through them and you go, why did this happen? How? Why me? This isn't fair, etc., etc. And you can get to a space over a period of time where you can actually reflect back and find joy in it and just understand that it is something that occurred, and I probably wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing today if I hadn't had the lived experience. So I wouldn't be able to have the lasting impact and hopefully leave a lasting legacy for generations to come in the work that I do if I hadn't have been a survivor of MGM. So there's always a serendipity somewhere.
Doesn't make going through it any easier, though.
We'd all do anything, I guess, to change the circumstances in which we all find ourselves, but they are what they are, and we walk the journey together day by day and support each other as best we can.
In your lifetime, Australia went from a culture that cut almost every male to one that's under 10%. But what was it like to live through that transition and to be a part of that transition as you are with your job and your advocacy work?
I've still got a circle of friends that I've known for over 40 years, and there's about 11 of us or so. You know, we've all had moved on, we live in different states and had kids and so on and so forth. But, all our kids were in the era of non-cutting. You just don't do that. So we knew there was a change, but there's nothing different about me. I'm still me. It's just if I'd have known about restoration earlier on in life, I'd have done it earlier on in life because, as I said before, I discovered at 18 what had been done and I was just horrified by it. And if I could have fixed it, I would have. So as soon as I found out that I could, I started. And there's probably others like me. You walk down any street now and you're walking along and you see different age demographics and you start to go, oh, so I wonder if he's one of the lucky ones in my age demographic or whether he was just one of the many hundreds of thousands that were not lucky. And then as you pass younger people, you might think, oh, they are of the lucky because they're of that age or whatever. I guess that might be how I think, how it's affected my thought process or whatever. But as far as it being kind of an everyday conversation or something with someone, no, probably not.
How have your friends and family reacted to your restoring? Like, do they know about it or?
Some do. It's not something that I publicly share with everyone. With family, yes. Close friends, some. Others, no. Just something I do, unless you're a naturist or into nudism or whatever, we're all clothed and we're all covered and none of us wear your penis out the fly of your trousers. So it's not something that particularly comes up in a conversation, but if it does come up in a conversation about whether I was cut or not cut, when they find out. I had an uneven cut. I was short inner skin on I call it the right-hand ventral quadrant, and I needed to even that up. So I did so successfully over a 3-year period of just being very diligent and focused on getting the time in. I started in November of 2016. Those first years were punctuated with dealing with significant and ongoing issues in the treatment of my late wife, who was dealing with stage 4 breast cancer, which ultimately claimed her life in May of 2018. So it was a bit sort of punctuated in those early stages and stuff. But in 2019, I ran into a fellow from California who'd married an Aussie girl. And of course, they had children and their boys are intact. And father was beginning his restoration journey. And we hit it off together, and we used to bounce ideas off one another. And he was the one that found the FEC link on the TLC website. It was a good thing to tell you about the force direct coverage measurement. But down the bottom of that, it talked about a little study that Ron did about hours under tension. And it's quite often missed by most people, but it was picked up by this fellow and we were talking about it. So it talked about a little control study that Ron did between one group and another group. One group did 11 plus hours a day and the other group didn't. And those that did the 11 plus hours a day got significantly better gains than those who didn't. So it started to make sense that it became a time under tension concept rather than the amount of tension, which just seems to cause tissue damage and then you have to stop. And it causes pain, and pain comes up when you're in the most awkward of situations that you can't do much about. So I went, there must be something to this. And then there was another post by a fellow called LC Burgundy, and he talked about how he went from a CI2 to a CI7 in 2 years using the TLC-X, and he kept his logs. It was over 10,000 hours logged over those 2 years. So he was under tension for 12 plus hours a day. So it made me understand that the time under tension concept was something that I needed to investigate. Since I understood that, it's become a game changer for me because it's not the amount, it's the time under the tension, under that gentle stretch where you're constantly stretching the skin. I tried devices for a bit. They just don't seem to be where it's at. So I chose the Andre's method and I used MM2 and MM3 consistently for 3 years. I just was very focused and very consistent. And if I was working away from home, I'd get up earlier in the morning. I'd get my hours in. I might have to do half-hour sessions for a bit, but I'd get some sessions in. So, I might get 15, 20 minutes in before I left the house. And then if I was out, depending on what situation I was in, if I was working in an office, I'd pop into the restroom for a break every 2 hours or so. You might get a few of those in for a couple of minutes. But I always made sure I got 45 minutes of MM3 in every day. And that did make a difference. That evened up the cut and it grew inner skin and, shaft skin. We don't realise really how much skin is actually removed and how much you actually have to put back. And, lots of people put up posts and go, I can't get over this hump. Well, it's a combination of both types of skin to get over the hump.
How's the equipment different when you use it?
The pleasure in the mobility of the skin, so the glide of the skin, is vastly different to what it was. So certainly the dynamic and the pleasure that derives for both is different. And the pleasure used to be in the finish. There's no pleasure during intercourse or foreplay or anything like that because you just don't feel anything much. All the pleasure came from the orgasm in the end. The pleasure nowadays comes from the lead up. So it comes from the foreplay. It comes from the actual act of sexual intercourse. So the pleasure's in the build-up now because the dynamic has changed. I used to hear stories of the intact penis functions like a piston sliding in and out of its sheath. That's exactly what it does. I don't know how to measure what I'd be in the erect state. I've got no idea. CI5 maybe, something like that. And maybe a bit more.
How has your view of your body changed with the restoration process?
Oh, now that's an interesting question because I hated being naked because I knew it wasn't right. To be naked around other people for in whatever reason, in your change room or whatever environment you're in, was just not a thing. I promised myself that if I ever got to a level where I could do a world naked bike ride and be comfortable, I would do so. And I did. It's not that it happens regularly, but if I'm out traveling or whatever and it's hot, it's summer, you go and have a swim at the beach or tidal pool or something like that, and then you've got to get changed and you go into a change room and the shower cubicle might be separate without a door or something, but the area where you keep your stuff dry on a bench and try to change and keep your feet dry and not drop your undies in the sloppy, sandy mess on the floor and all those things is communal. And I don't worry about it anymore. I feel normal. It's an interesting sensation that I don't think any intact man would ever give it any thought. But to be covered and to have your glands covered all the time and tucked inside clothing, there is no feeling. There's no rubbing, there's no abrading, there's no feeling. It just feels snug and warm, like it's inside a sleeping bag, like it's meant to be, and it's protected. And I don't really give it any thought. There's just no feeling there. And occasionally I give it a thought and I go, yep, that's why I did this and that's how it's meant to be. So from an emotional perspective, a personal perspective, I guess I feel whole. I can't totally repair what was done because, like most of us, the frenulum was damaged and the sensitive nerves that go with that. There's a certain level of comfort and satisfaction that comes from standing and looking at the naked person in the mirror nowadays and going, yep, that's just how it's meant to be and how it should have been all along. And to be able to, not that I parade around publicly and naked, but to be able to do, the world naked bike ride and feel normal and whole was just such a weird reward. I don't know that I'll do another one, but I certainly did that one, came away from it and went, yeah, there you go. Good feeling.
Hi, friends. We want to take a break to talk about our Patreon members who are helping us spread the word about the negative effects of circumcision and the possibility of restoration. Our Patreon members donate as little as $3 a month to help us pay for podcast hosting and pay-per-click advertising, and you can too by clicking the link in the show notes. We can change the world when we work together. Please consider becoming a Patreon member today.
What officially is your job, and what was kind of your educational background you kind of got to get that?
I had to study a law degree. That was my second degree that I did. I did that late in life. In my early career after I left school, I started doing the studies, but after a couple of years, I became very jaded by the profession, and I basically said to myself, you're a pack of arseholes and I don't want to become an arsehole like you guys, so I'm not going to become a lawyer. So I walked away from that and went off to do a science degree with a view to becoming a pharmacist. I actually went to commence studying pharmacy, but at about the same time, my late wife had discovered the Amway business back in those days. We knew what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to achieve a life where we were going to live on the north coast of New South Wales, somewhere up around the Byron Bay area. And I would do locum work up and down the coast, having time on, time off, and enjoying some good life without working full time and busting our boilers. She saw the Amway business and sort of encouraged me to have a look at it as well. And we saw that as a way of being able to create that kind of lifestyle situation. So I didn't end up doing pharmacy, although I got accepted in to do pharmacy. And we spent a couple of years developing that business and did reasonably well, and got to the point where we were able to decide that we would sell everything up and move to where we are now. And then we set about designing and building our own home, and we did that. And then Denise went back to work and I finished building the house. And then I went back to what I knew, which was working in a lawyer's office doing some stuff. And I'd had all this experience and knowledge from before. And so they started to take advantage of that. And by that time, I was in my late 40s, early 50s. The manufactured global financial crisis that smashed us all to pieces in the 2008, 2009, somewhere around that, knocked us around a bit. We were holding some investment properties and so on and so forth. I sort of had to go back and find some more full-time work. So at about that point, she encouraged me and said, well, if you're going to stick at what you're doing, go get your bit of paper and get what you were. So I knuckled down and knocked off a 6-year course in 33 months, got my qualification so that I could have a practicing certificate. Now I do mostly what we call collaborative family law. So that's assisting parties with the pulling apart of their matrimonial property and relationship in a dignified and respectful kind of way without going and having an all-out War of the Roses in a courtroom situation. I could be a lot busier than I am, but I choose to work the way I do because I have the flexibility to do what I want to do. And I've realised that I didn't have to become like the arseholes that I was surrounded by. I could actually practice law the way I think it should be practiced. And I also spend a significant amount of my time working with other organisations around the world with the Darbon Institute in the work that we do, and all of that is volunteer. If I hadn't have been a survivor of male genital mutilation, I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing now because I wouldn't have any concept of it nor any need for it. And you look back at times on the things that have occurred in your life. I look back now and I often think, why me? Why was it done to me? I financially support as best I can 15 Square in the United Kingdom because they are by far at the moment the only known men's charity organisation around the world providing peer support programs for survivors of MGM and the resources to help people understand and come to terms with things, and the resources to help people deal with phimosis other than being circumcised, which is what the medical profession will offer you. And I think Intact America have kind of tried to hit on the mark with their new Skin in the Game program. and people being able to tell their story and so on and so forth. But I mean, I really would like to see more services made available for people to be able to get professional help and recognition that this is a significant trauma from which they can heal, given the right support.
It's very weird how people don't consider the ethical implications. They'll consider all these things for other groups, other parts of the body. It's like their brain breaks for this one part of the body and just for men and boys.
Yeah, it is. And it's one of the reasons why I do work with the Darbon Institute here. There was a case of two little boys in Perth in 2021 or 2022, I think it was. There were two little boys of Muslim faith subjected to circumcision. There were complications arising from the procedure that apparently arose from the application of the anaesthesia, which led to the death of one little boy and put his brother in hospital in a serious condition from which I believe he has recovered. And there again, the police just looked into it and went, oh, no case to answer here, nothing wrong, just these things happen. So like in the US, the actual reporting of deaths or incidents or complications from this procedure go under the radar. And I'm sure you in the US report it's about 100 boys a year that die from this procedure. I'm sure that that's probably well over into the thousands, given the numbers that are subjected to the procedure in the US. They just put it down to things like complications from anesthesia or something, you know. And then there's the recent case in Ireland, a Jewish doctor and again Moyle from now, for those who don't know what a Moyle is the trained Jewish circumciser. Sometimes they're trained medical doctors, sometimes they're not. This fellow was. For some reason, you can't do it over there. So you could do it in Northern Ireland because he can do it in the UK, but he couldn't do it in Ireland. He was arrested by the cops and his passport was withheld because he was deemed to be a flight risk by the magistrate, and he's awaiting a hearing because he illegally performed circumcision on two boys when it wasn't allowed. So, you know, more and more of this stuff's coming to light and more the authorities are being called upon. The ever-vigilant National Secular Society in the United Kingdom and 15 Square keep their eye on what's going on over there. We here keep our eye on what's going on over here. So I think it's becoming more evident for the medical profession that, you know, there may be implications of doing this procedure on children when it's not got any clinical relevance, that it could expose them to civil liability and their professional indemnity insurer may not cover them. And if that's the case, then it becomes a real financial disincentive to be able to continue doing a procedure in this country if there's an accident or whatever and the medical professional insurer says, well, you shouldn't be doing this procedure because it's a cosmetic procedure that's being done on children too young to consent. It's a breach of the ethics and you shouldn't be doing it. If you're of age old enough to understand the implications and give consent, I don't know whether you have that same competency in the United States, but here we call it Gillick competency, and it comes from an English case in the 70s, maybe. Anyhow, Gillick and West Hampshire Medical Service or something like that. If you Google Gillick competency, you'll find the English case it came from. And it basically says that somewhere around about the age of 14 or 15, most children would develop Gillick competency to be able to consent to medical procedures. But prior to that, the child probably doesn't have sufficient competency. And so that decision rests with the parents. And the parents need to act in the best interests of the child. Now, one of the things you find when you go delve into the best interests of the child test is it's a very grey area. Like all legal areas, there's no black and white. It's very grey, but it's even more grey. It's very dark grey. If I was a medical practitioner and I'm relying on the parents to make a best interest decision on a non-Gillick competent child, so a child, under 13 or so, I'm on shaky ground, because there was a decision of the High Court of Australia called Marion's case in the early 90s, which was a decision for the sterilisation of a severely handicapped adult child. At first instance, the judge gave approval. It was appealed and it went to the full court of the family court, who overturned the decision of the original judge, and it was subsequently appealed from the full court of the family court up to the High Court. And the High Court decision in Marion's case, it basically says that medical procedures that alter the sex characteristics or the reproductive characteristics of children or adults that are unable to give consent need the consent of the court. And to proceed with a procedure like that without consent, a medical practitioner can't do it. And then here it comes. There was the exception for male circumcision. That wasn't part of the main decision. That was what we call obiter dicta. So, one of the dissenting judges at the time threw out a remark that he basically agreed with the basic sentiment of the case, but not when it's male circumcision. Well, you have to understand the makeup of the court in the early 90s was male predominantly, and they'd have probably all been circumcised. So it's the same old issue that you get. For a circumcised man to realise that circumcision is harmful and wrong, he must first come to the reality that he was harmed and wronged. And it is far easier to dismiss that thought process and pretend that you are okay. But in doing so, you then perpetuate the harm on the next generation and the cycle continues. So the other thing that will happen in Australia over time is that our ageing male population who are circumcised will die. If you're 55 and over, the bulk of those people are circumcised in this country. If you're sitting somewhere between 40 and 55, probably about 60%, 65% chance of being circumcised. And then under 40, the majority of males in this country under 40 would be intact. As time goes on and those older people die out, the procedure dies out too. The United States isn't there yet. You haven't had this seismic shift yet. But it'll happen. Most children today in Australia would be born in a public hospital, and the baby would be sent home intact because unless it's clinically necessary to preserve the sanctity of life, the public hospital system does not circumcise children anymore.
This podcast is hosted by Dick Guyver and edited by Open Roads. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. Want to join our weekly video chat? Click the link in the show notes for details. We also need your help to keep this podcast going. For just $3 a month, you can help us pay for the podcast and inspire others in their foreskin restoration journeys. Thanks for listening, and look for new episodes coming soon.